Gaslight trembles, silk whispers. At St. Bride's a bride waits, and the groom does not come. In a single breath, promises shatter, fortunes vanish, and London's polite smiles curl into knives. Was this cowardice, or a conspiracy signed in elegant ink? As whispers coil through drawing rooms and counting houses, one woman must choose: bow to ruin, or turn her heartbreak into a weapon. Behind every ledger lies a secret. Behind every smile, a price. Duty pulls one way, desire another, and the past is already knocking. Tell us where you're listening from and join the conversation. What do you most love in period romances? Duty versus desire, scandal or redemption? Settle in. The first page is about to burn. London, 1868. The air outside St. Bride's Church was thick with spring mist, perfumed faintly with rain and horse-drawn carriages waiting along Fleet Street. Inside, the sanctuary glimmered under gaslight, its pale stone and gilt candlesticks casting a soft, trembling glow over rows of expectant faces. Lace fans fluttered. Diamonds winked from gloved hands. The organ murmured low notes of solemn joy. Every gaze turned toward the heavy oak doors, waiting for the bride who was to marry the promising young investor, Mr. Arthur Pelham. Beatrice Larkspur stood just beyond those doors, her heart a fragile cage beneath the ivory satin of her gown. The veil, trimmed in French lace, trembled as she breathed. Around her, her bridesmaids whispered soft encouragements that could not reach the hollow in her chest. The scent of orange blossoms and beeswax candles clung to the air, sweet and suffocating all at once. Her brother Nathaniel stood by her side, pale beneath his freckles, his spectacles misted from the damp morning air. "You look perfect, Bee," he said, his voice quivering with pride and something else, an unease he could not name. She smiled faintly, her gloved hand tightening around his arm. "Let us go forward," she whispered. "Arthur is waiting." But when the verger pushed open the great doors and the music rose, there was no sign of Arthur Pelham at the altar. A murmur rippled through the church. Guests shifted in their seats, the organ faltered. The minister glanced at the doorway, then toward the groomsmen, whose strained expressions betrayed what Beatrice's heart already sensed, but refused to understand. The pews seemed to tilt, the light dimmed, and a strange silence fell. A silence so sharp it seemed to hum. Then, at the end of the aisle, a young clerk in a damp overcoat entered, clutching a sealed envelope. His boots echoed across the marble floor as he approached the minister, whispering something hurriedly before retreating. The clergyman hesitated, then stepped toward her, his face ashen. "Miss Larkspur," he murmured softly, "there has been an unforeseen delay. Mr. Pelham is—" But Beatrice was already reaching for the letter. Her name, written in Arthur's precise hand, blurred before her eyes. The edges of the paper cut faintly into her glove as she broke the seal. "My dearest Beatrice, forgive me, for I am not worthy of the life you would have given me. Circumstances beyond my control force me to leave London at once. Please understand that I have done what I must. May you find happiness, even if not with me. Arthur." Her breath caught, and the words blurred into meaningless ink. She stood frozen as whispers erupted among the congregation. Somewhere behind her, someone gasped her name. Another voice, sharp, pitying, murmured that her dowry had been withdrawn from the bank the previous afternoon. Nathaniel reached for her, his hand trembling. "Beatrice, come away, please, before they—" But she could not move. It was as though the marble beneath her feet had turned to ice. She felt every eye upon her, their sympathy cutting deeper than scorn. The air grew heavy with perfume, heat, and humiliation. Her world, stitched together by trust and duty, began to unravel, thread by thread. When at last she allowed Nathaniel to lead her away from the altar, the whispers followed like a shadow. Outside, the drizzle had turned to rain, streaking her veil with tiny silver trails. The carriage that was meant to carry her to her new home now stood idle and useless. Inside it lay her bouquet, already wilting, Back at the Larkspur townhouse on Farringdon Street, the silence was unbearable. The servants avoided her eyes. The parlour smelled faintly of lilacs, her mother's favourite scent now cloying in the still air. Nathaniel paced, clutching an open letter from the bank. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "He took everything, Bea. Every shilling father left us." Beatrice sat motionless before the cold hearth. Her wedding gown, heavy with damp silk and crushed lace, clung to her like a reminder of her folly. "No," she said at last, her voice barely a whisper. "Not everything." Nathaniel looked at her in confusion. She lifted her chin. "He has my name, my promise, my public disgrace, but not my soul. That remains mine." Her brother's eyes filled with helpless sorrow. "What will you do?" She rose slowly, the candlelight catching the steel glint in her grey-blue eyes. "I will uncover what he's done," she said, "and I will see the truth laid bare." Outside, the rain beat harder against the windows, as if London itself wept for her. Yet within her chest, something fierce began to stir, a spark of pride, small but unyielding. That night, while the city slept beneath its veil of fog, Beatrice removed her wedding gown and folded it carefully into a cedar chest. The sound of silk rustling against wood felt like the closing of one life and the beginning of another. She dressed in a simple wool gown, tied her hair back, and sat before her father's old writing desk. The ledgers from the firm lay open before her, columns of numbers, names, and inked signatures that had once meant security, now tainted with deceit. Her finger paused over a familiar line of writing. Arthur's signature, clear and elegant, beside another bolder name she did not yet recognize, Calder Wren. The firelight flickered, reflecting in her eyes like the birth of a storm. In that quiet hour, Beatrice Larkspur swore to herself that she would never again be the innocent woman who waited at an altar for salvation. She would find the man who had betrayed her trust, expose every shadow he hid behind, and reclaim her life from the ashes. And though her heart still trembled with grief, a new vow was written silently in her soul, a vow forged not in love, but in fire. The fog of London lingered for days after the wedding that never was, pressing against the tall windows of the Larkspur townhouse like a spectre unwilling to depart. Each morning arrived in shades of grey, and each night fell without stars. The city moved on with its unfeeling rhythm. Carriages clattered, merchants shouted, factories bellowed smoke. But inside the once prosperous home on Farringdon Street, time had slowed to a suffocating crawl. Nathaniel Larkspur sat in his study, shoulders hunched beneath the faint glow of a single oil lamp, his spectacles slipping down the bridge of his nose as he pored over the ledgers that had once been the pride of their late father. The books now looked like relics of a broken promise, pages smudged, margins filled with calculations that no longer balanced. His hands trembled slightly as he turned each page, as if the numbers themselves accused him of negligence. From the doorway, Beatrice watched him in silence. Her wedding gown had been returned to its chest, never to be touched again. She now wore a dark wool dress with a modest collar, her auburn hair pulled back in a low twist, its simplicity a quiet act of mourning and defiance. The light from the lamp brushed against her face, revealing the hollowness beneath her cheekbones, the faint shadows under her eyes. Yet there was something new in her expression, a sharpened calm, the steadiness of a woman who had already walked through humiliation and found something colder than fear on the other side. "Put it away, Nathaniel," she said softly, stepping closer. "You will ruin your eyes for nothing." He exhaled shakily, closing one ledger and pressing his palms against his temples. "Nothing balances, Bea. The accounts from the last quarter, gone. Father's investments, the trade shipments, all tied to Arthur's transactions. He used our name to move funds we never saw." She moved beside him and placed a hand over the ledger, tracing a line of ink with her gloved fingertip. The columns of figures blurred into meaning, one signature after another, Arthur's elegant handwriting looping beside names she barely recognized. "Have you spoken to the bank?" she asked. They say the accounts were closed with my authorization, Nathaniel whispered. Forged, of course, but the damage is done. Beatrice lifted her gaze to the shelves lined with volumes of trade law and mercantile correspondence. Once her father had read those books aloud to them as children, proud of his modest success in a city built on ambition. Now that same city seemed to mock their naivety. We will find where it began, she murmured. And who else profited? Nathaniel looked up, startled. This is not your burden. She met his eyes firmly. He used my name as much as yours, my dowry, my letters of recommendation. He humiliated me in front of all London, and I let him, because I believed him. That mistake is mine to mend. Her voice was calm, but beneath it ran a quiet current of fire. Nathaniel recognized it, the same strength that had once made their mother call her tempered steel. She gathered the ledgers in her arms and carried them to the drawing room, where daylight seeped weakly through lace curtains. The room still smelled faintly of lilacs, but the flowers in the vase had wilted into a brown tangle. She laid the books across the mahogany table, one by one, opening them like wounds to be examined. For hours she read in silence. The rain pattered against the windows, the coal fire hissed. Her eyes followed the columns of inked numbers until they became familiar patterns. Shipments listed under false dates, letters of credit transferred between companies she'd never heard of. The same names surfaced over and over again. Wren Industries, Calder Wren. She whispered it aloud, testing the sound. It was a name spoken often in the newspapers of the day. A man who had risen from a clerk's desk to control vast portions of England's new railway lines. A man the aristocracy tolerated but never embraced. A man with enough influence to move fortunes with a single pen stroke. Beatrice sat back, the faint rustle of her skirts breaking the silence. Why would a man like Calder Wren appear among Arthur's dealings? Had Arthur borrowed from him, or betrayed him as well? Or had he been working with him all along? That night she found herself unable to sleep. From her chamber window she watched the fog twist through the gaslit streets below. Somewhere beyond that veil of smoke and rain, men like Wren shaped the destinies of families like hers, all while dining in marble halls and signing papers that could destroy a life. She thought of Arthur's letter, the cowardice hidden behind words of false regret, and a chill passed through her. He had written circumstances beyond my control. Whose control, then, had replaced his? The next morning, Beatrice rose before dawn. She tied a shawl around her shoulders, left a note for Nathaniel, and stepped into the grey mist of London. The city smelled of soot and damp stone. Street sweepers moved sluggishly through puddles, and milkmen rattled their carts. The world was waking, indifferent to her ruin. She walked toward the bank where Arthur had held their accounts. The clerk at the counter, a young man with ink-stained fingers, recognized her name and stiffened. Society had already whispered about the jilted bride, the vanished groom, the fortune lost. Still, she stood with her back straight and her gloves folded neatly on the counter. "I wish to see the manager," she said, her voice steady as glass. Half an hour later, she sat across from a balding man with a kind smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Larkspur," he began delicately, "I am afraid we've already responded to your brother's inquiries. The withdrawals were made in good faith, documentation complete, signatures verified." Beatrice opened her reticule and withdrew one of the ledgers she had copied by hand. "And yet," she said, pointing to a date, "this transaction was recorded 2 days after my brother's signature was forged on another document. Tell me, Mr. Hensley, do your policies allow for contradictions within the same fiscal week?" The man blinked. "Miss Larkspur, such matters are complex, I am sure," she interrupted, her tone polite but unyielding. "But I would hate for this complexity to become public knowledge. The Times would take great interest in a bank that cannot distinguish truth from forgery." Her words hung in the air like a drawn blade. The manager's smile faltered. "I will review this personally," he murmured. "Please do," she replied, rising gracefully. "And if you happen upon any correspondence with a Mr. Calder Wren, I would appreciate a copy." She left the bank with her head held high, though her heart pounded beneath her bodice. Outside, the rain had begun again, turning the cobblestones slick. She drew her shawl closer and watched as an omnibus rolled past, its wheels splashing through puddles. On its side was an advertisement painted in gold letters: Wren Industries, building the future of Britain. The words burned in her mind all the way home. By evening she found Nathaniel in the parlour, staring blankly at a newspaper. "B," he said in disbelief. "It's in here. Arthur. He's been seen in Brussels, staying at the Hotel de l'Europe under another name. They say he's entertaining investors and living like a prince." Beatrice took the paper from his trembling hands. There it was, printed in bold type: "Rumoured English financier, seen in Brussels after mysterious departure from London." Her jaw tightened as she read the lines again. The article mentioned his companions: foreign businessmen, unnamed patrons. The world had already forgiven him, or forgotten her. Nathaniel's voice wavered. "We are finished, B. The firm, the accounts, our credit. It's all gone." She folded the paper neatly and set it aside. "Then we begin again," she said. "But this time we will begin with the truth." He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "And what will you do?" "Find Calder Wren," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "If he was part of Arthur's deceit, I will expose him. If he was not, he may hold the key to why my life was destroyed." Nathaniel shook his head. "Beatrice, this man is dangerous. The newspapers call him ruthless." A faint smile touched her lips. "Then he will not frighten easily, and neither will I." That night, as the clock struck 10, Beatrice sat again before her father's desk. The ledgers were open, the ink fresh on her fingertips. Each page was a map of betrayal, but also a compass pointing her forward. The rain had stopped, leaving the city glistening outside her window. A carriage passed below, its wheels slicing through the wet silence. Beatrice's reflection in the glass was pale but unbroken. The scandal had taken her dowry, her place in society, her name whispered in pity, but not her will. Beneath the lace collar of her gown, her heart beat with new resolve. For the first time since the day the church doors opened on her disgrace, Beatrice felt the faint pulse of purpose. She would trace the lies through every ledger and follow the ink-stained path to the man whose name haunted the margins of her ruin: Calder Wren. The name shimmered in her thoughts like a challenge cast into fire, and in that moment, as dawn's pale light touched the city's spires, Beatrice Larkspur no longer felt like a forsaken bride. She felt like a woman reborn, quiet, calculating, and ready to fight for the life she refused to surrender. The carriages lined Grosvenor Square like gilded beetles, each glinting beneath the gaslight as they arrived one by one before the marbled entrance of the Langdon house. From within, music drifted in golden waves, a quartet performing a delicate nocturne, the gentle trill of strings barely masking the tide of hushed laughter, murmured speculation, and clinking crystal. It was a night of charity, of lace fans and polished shoes, of jeweled brooches pinned to gowns stitched by the deft hands of underpaid seamstresses. A night where fortune disguised itself in silks and deception hid behind every pleasant smile. Beatrice Larkspur stepped from the hired carriage with her head held high. Her gown, midnight blue with black velvet trim, clung to her figure in elegant defiance of recent scandal. She wore no diamonds, only a single jet brooch at her throat and gloves, as pale as her porcelain skin. Her hair was arranged in a braided coil, adorned with a simple black ribbon. She looked neither like a debutante nor a grieving widow, but something far more arresting, a woman whose silence no longer served her. A few heads turned as she entered the marble vestibule, though none dared approach. Whispers bloomed behind fans. The Larkspur name, once associated with stable trade and polite respectability, now stirred curiosity, tinged with pity, and something colder: suspicion. Yet she moved with a quiet dignity through the crowd, her chin raised, her gaze calm, as though she had come to bless the gathering rather than confront it. She had not come for music or for charity. She had come for Calder Wren. It was not difficult to locate him. He stood near the tall, arched windows of the main salon, where gaslight flickered across the polished parquet floor, and gilded mirrors cast distorted reflections of the city's most dangerous men disguised as gentlemen. He wore black, not the stiff austerity of mourning, but the sleek command of a man who had no need for color. His frock coat was finely tailored, his waistcoat subtly patterned in dark jacquard, and a pocket watch chain glinted across his chest like a delicate threat. His cravat, neatly tied, bore no ornament, no pin. The severity suited him. Beatrice watched him a moment before approaching. He did not smile. His posture remained still, but his eyes, deep-set and uncomfortably penetrating, turned toward her as though he had sensed her presence before she spoke. Hazel, she noted. Not the warmth of autumn, but the steel of a forest at dusk. Mr. Wren, she said, her voice even, her gloved hands clasped before her. He inclined his head with polite detachment. Miss Larkspur, I confess I did not expect to make your acquaintance tonight. I suspect there are many things you did not expect, she replied. May we speak privately? A flicker passed through his expression, not surprise but calculation. He offered her his arm, and she took it with measured grace. Together they stepped into a quieter corridor, where the music became a whisper and the laughter faded behind brocade curtains. The chamber they entered was small, reserved for committee discussions or whispered arrangements. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows across damask walls. Calder closed the door behind them. I presume this is not a social call, he said. Beatrice turned to face him fully, her spine straight, her gloves removed. Her hands, though small, did not tremble. I have spent the last week reviewing ledgers, bank statements, and bills of lading tied to my father's firm. His accounts were used to move money, through fictitious shipments, through dummy partnerships. The transactions bear two signatures, Arthur Pelham's and yours. He regarded her in silence, but there was no flicker of guilt or denial. Only the quiet intensity of a man waiting for his opponent to reveal her full hand. She continued, stepping closer. Your name appears on a note exchanged the same day my family's holdings were frozen. Your company benefited from those funds. I do not believe in coincidence, Mr. Wren. His gaze did not falter. Neither do I. Beatrice stiffened. You admit it? I admit my name is on those documents. But you should ask yourself, why would a man of my standing risk exposure by lending his name to forged transactions? She narrowed her eyes. Because you were either complicit or careless. Neither absolves you. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. You speak like someone who has not been broken yet. I have been broken, she replied, her voice low and fierce. But unlike most, I intend to rise with the pieces sharper. Calder's expression shifted then, not softened, not gentled, but deepened. He stepped toward the fire and reached into his coat. From within he drew a folded sheet, unsealed, and handed it to her. She read it in silence. It was a correspondence between two investors, names she did not recognize but whose signatures matched those in the ledgers. They spoke of Larkspur and Co. as a convenient channel and praised the discretion of Mr. Pelham's courtship. At the bottom, Calder's own handwriting, notes in the margin, investigate ties to Pelham's associate Hatherley, multiple accounts, fabricated. Beatrice looked up, stunned. You were watching him. I was watching them all, he said. Pelham was merely one among many, a polished pawn. He moved as instructed, flattering widows, marrying well, appearing legitimate. Your family was chosen because you were stable, reputable, and predictable. They did not expect you to dig. I did. Why? Calder's eyes darkened. Because these men nearly ruined me 6 years ago. They prey on trust, on decency. I let my guard down once and lost more than money. I have not made that mistake again. Beatrice returned the letter. though her fingers hesitated. "You could have warned us." "I tried. I sent an inquiry through your firm's solicitor. It was intercepted." "Your brother never saw it." He paused, then added, "I didn't expect to find you standing in front of me. Most women disappear after a scandal." She met his gaze with unflinching pride. "Then you have been speaking to the wrong women." The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but thick with unspoken truths. The fire crackled softly. Calder studied her with new interest, not as a victim but as something rarer, a woman whose mind had met his with equal precision. "You're wasting your talents on grief," he said at last. "And you're hiding yours behind coldness," she replied. A faint tension rippled through the air. Beatrice stepped back, breath quickening despite herself. She had not expected him to affect her so. This man of iron and smoke, whose gaze burned hotter than the fire behind him. She had come to confront a villain, not to recognize a mirror. "I do not trust you," she said quietly. "You shouldn't," he answered. "And yet, you may be the only person who can help me expose the truth." Calder nodded once. "And you may be the only person with enough credibility left to enter the circles I cannot." Her brows arched. "Are you proposing an alliance?" He extended his hand. "A temporary one, based on mutual benefit, nothing more." She looked at his hand for a moment, broad, gloved, and very still. Then slowly, she placed hers in it. The contact was brief, but the heat of it lingered like a brand. "Very well," she said, "but if you deceive me, Mr. Wren—" He leaned slightly closer, his voice a quiet flame. "Then I'll deserve whatever you do to me." As they returned to the salon, the music swelled once more. Guests turned toward them, murmuring anew. But neither Beatrice nor Calder noticed. For the first time since her world crumbled, she was no longer alone. And he, for all his power and precision, was no longer unchallenged. What neither could admit was this, that something had shifted in that quiet room of fire and shadows. A thread had been drawn taut between them, invisible and unspoken, but unmistakably real. And though neither wore their hearts on their sleeves, both had felt the same thing in that one charged glance. Danger, not of ruin, but of something far more perilous. Possibility. London had begun to thaw. The first breath of spring drifted through the fog, softening the edges of the city's grey skyline. But inside Calder Wren's world, the drawing rooms where contracts were signed in whispers and fortunes built on deceit, there was no season, but ambition. Beatrice Larkspur arrived at his offices on Threadneedle Street just as the bells of St. Paul's struck 10. The air smelled faintly of ink, brass, and coal. Clerks passed her with hurried steps, their arms full of ledgers, eyes fixed on the ground as though the very walls could listen. A porter, seeing her fine gloves and proud bearing, hesitated before showing her in. Calder's office was an empire of order. A great mahogany desk dominated the room, flanked by shelves lined with books on finance and trade. Maps of railway routes hung beside oil paintings of stormy seas. He stood near the window, tall and still, hands clasped behind his back. The morning light caught the faint streaks of grey at his temples and the sharp lines of his profile. He looked like a man carved from restraint. "You are punctual," he said without turning. "I dislike giving men reason to doubt me," Beatrice replied, stepping closer. He glanced at her then, eyes the colour of burnished iron. "You will find that most men doubt women by habit, not by reason. Then let us give them cause to regret it." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He gestured toward the desk, where several ledgers lay open. "These," he said, "belong to a firm called Hatherley and Sons. On paper they appear unremarkable, modest profits, steady trade. But look closely. The handwriting changes mid-quarter, and the margins contain irregular annotations. They're laundering funds through phantom partners." Beatrice leaned forward, scanning the neat columns of ink. Her gloved hand traced a date, then paused. "This entry repeats the figure from a week prior, yet the goods listed differ. A simple clerk might overlook it." "Exactly," Calder said, "but you didn't." She looked up at him, catching the flicker of approval in his gaze. "You underestimate how quickly women learn when the price of ignorance is ruin." He regarded her a moment longer before returning his focus to the ledgers. "We'll work quietly. You have access to circles I do not, wives, widows, the charitable committees where gossip is currency. I need names, invitations, rumors whispered behind lace fans. In return, I will teach you how to read between the numbers that ruin men." Beatrice nodded, her pulse steady. "Very well, but let me be clear. I am not your subordinate, Mr. Wren. This is an alliance, not a rescue." "I would expect nothing less," he said softly. Their days began to fall into a rhythm, mornings spent among ledgers and correspondence, evenings in drawing rooms of London's elite. Beatrice observed, listened, and returned with fragments of conversation. Names mentioned too often, charities with untraceable donors, contracts passed between hands after midnight suppers. Calder, in turn, showed her how to piece those fragments together into truth. He taught her how ink could lie, how handwriting could betray a man's fear, how the spacing of numbers could reveal manipulation. He showed her how to recognize the weight of a forged signature, the slant too perfect, the flourish rehearsed. "You see," he said one afternoon, guiding her attention to a page beneath the lamplight, "this signature was written with confidence, but no hesitation. It isn't Pelham's hand, yet it imitates his rhythm. Whoever signed this knew him intimately." Beatrice's chest tightened. "Arthur's handwriting," she murmured, "was precise, almost vain. He'd practiced it before letters to my father. This hand is colder." "Professional," Calder corrected quietly. "Whoever forged it has done so many times before." She raised her eyes to him, and for a moment their gazes locked, his steady, analytical, hers burning with something he hadn't expected. "Does it ever weigh on you," she asked, "to see the world reduced to ledgers and deceit?" Calder hesitated. "Once," he said finally. "Not anymore." "And what changed?" He turned away, the question striking deeper than she knew. "A fever," he said simply, "the kind that leaves nothing untouched." Beatrice did not speak. The silence between them stretched, tender and dangerous. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, the amber liquid catching the light. "My wife, Clara," he said, his voice low, "she fell ill before I built any of this. I thought power could protect us. I was wrong. I buried her before I had a chance to keep my promise." Beatrice accepted the glass he offered, her fingers brushing his for a heartbeat. The contact was brief but electric. "I am sorry," she whispered. Calder's mouth curved into something almost like a smile. "Don't be. Grief made me efficient." But she saw it then. The faint fracture beneath his composure, the shadow of a man who had locked his heart behind walls of arithmetic and steel. As days passed, their alliance deepened. They met in different corners of London, the reading rooms of gentlemen's clubs where she arrived under the pretense of delivering documents, the discreet coffee houses near the Exchange, the smoky back rooms of taverns where bribes were paid in whispers. Beatrice adapted swiftly. Her eyes, once soft with trust, grew sharp, her questions precise. The clerks began to fear her quiet presence more than Calder's commanding voice. And Calder, for all his stoicism, found himself watching her more closely than he should, how the candlelight caught the curve of her cheek, how determination made her beautiful. One evening she joined him at his townhouse on Park Lane to review correspondence seized from a defunct brokerage. The fire burned low, casting the room in gold and shadow. She removed her gloves and leaned over the desk, her sleeve brushing his hand as she turned a page. "Here," she murmured. "This seal, it appears on several letters. Who is B.H.?" Calder studied it. "Benedict Hatherley, a philanthropist, a member of Parliament's Finance Committee. He's the kind of man who smiles as he robs you." Beatrice's breath caught. "Then he's the one behind it." "One of them," Calder corrected. "Never forget, the powerful seldom act alone." She looked up, her eyes steady on his. "Then we will make them answer, one by one. He should have looked away. Instead, his gaze lingered, tracing the determination in her face, the quiet fire beneath it. The moment stretched, a breath too long, a silence too full. He stepped back abruptly. "You should go," he said. "It's late. Does my presence disturb you, Mr. Wren?" "More than I care to admit," he replied, almost under his breath. She gathered her papers slowly. "Then perhaps you should grow used to it." When she left, the air seemed colder. Calder remained by the fire long after, staring at the chair she had occupied, at the delicate indentation her presence had left upon his ordered world. Days later, at a luncheon hosted by Lady Armitage, Beatrice executed her part of their arrangement flawlessly. She smiled where she needed to, listened when others prattled, and caught a stray mention of Hatherley's charitable trust, a fund suspected of diverting public donations. When she relayed it to Calder that evening, he regarded her with quiet admiration. "You learn faster than I expected," he said. "I've had reason to," she replied, her tone laced with irony. "Loss teaches as efficiently as ambition." He inclined his head. "Then we are alike in more ways than I thought." For a moment the room seemed to shrink around them. Beatrice felt the weight of his gaze, and something inside her, long dormant, stirred. Yet she turned away, unwilling to give it shape. Their alliance, though practical, had become an unspoken duel of wills, each testing the other, neither yielding. He admired her precision, her refusal to flatter. She, in turn, found herself drawn to the paradox of him, a man made of discipline who still carried grief like a living wound. That night, as she returned home through the fog-choked streets, Beatrice pressed a hand against her chest and felt her heartbeat racing, not from fear, but from recognition. She had entered Calder Wren's world of iron and smoke to uncover truth, but she had not expected to find herself reflected in it. And somewhere, in the quiet chambers of his guarded heart, Calder Wren realized that the woman he had meant to use as a pawn was becoming something far more dangerous, his equal. London's elite moved as one glittering organism beneath the chandeliers of Hatherley House. The ballroom glowed with the reflection of crystal and gilt, the air thick with the perfume of magnolias and ambition. Women in silks the color of wine and moonlight drifted between marble pillars, and men in immaculate coats exchanged promises disguised as compliments. Laughter floated above the music like fragile glass, polished, hollow, easily shattered. Beatrice Larkspur stood at the top of the grand staircase, her gloved hand resting lightly on the carved banister, her gaze sweeping over the scene below. From that height, she could almost pretend she was a guest like any other, a woman admired, respected, untouched by scandal. Yet every whisper that followed her down the stairs reminded her that London never truly forgets disgrace, it simply disguises it in courtesy. Her gown, a deep shade of garnet trimmed with black lace, shimmered faintly each time she moved. The color had been a deliberate choice, bold, defiant, and impossible to overlook. Around her neck she wore a single strand of jet beads, and in her eyes the cool steadiness of a woman who had nothing left to lose except her silence. At her side walked Calder Wren. His dark attire was unadorned, his expression inscrutable. He carried himself with the quiet command of a man who had long ceased to seek approval. The crowd parted subtly as they passed, some out of respect, others out of unease. Rumors of his wealth, his ruthlessness, and his peculiar alliance with the fallen Miss Larkspur had already begun to ripple through London's parlours. "Do you regret accepting my invitation?" Calder asked softly, his voice low enough to be lost beneath the waltz. "Regret?" Beatrice replied without looking at him. "I came to confront truth, not to avoid it." He inclined his head slightly. "Then tonight, truth will not hide." Her eyes followed the figure at the far end of the ballroom, Arthur Pelham, impeccably dressed, his blonde hair gleaming under the light, his smile as polished and false as ever. He laughed easily among his new circle, men with rings of gold and pockets lined with deceit, and beside them stood the host of the evening, Benedict Hatherley himself. Hatherley was a man whose very posture declared ownership of every room he entered. His hair, silver at the temples, gleamed like a badge of wisdom. His cravat was fastened with a sapphire pin said to have belonged to a duke. He greeted guests with paternal warmth, his voice carrying the perfect balance of charm and authority. To the world, he was the image of integrity, a benefactor of orphanages, patron of hospitals, a man who funded virtue with one hand and filth with the other. Beatrice and Calder descended into that gilded pit with the grace of two players entering a stage already set for betrayal. The scent of roses and wax mingled with the sharper tang of deceit. "Mr. Wren," came Hatherley's smooth, resonant voice as they approached. "A pleasure, as always. And Miss Larkspur." His smile did not reach his pale blue eyes. "I must say, London admires your courage in returning to society. Few would dare show such fortitude. And courage and necessity often wear the same face," Beatrice said evenly, "and London's admiration is rarely as valuable as its silence." Calder's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, at her reply. Hatherley's smile tightened. "Still sharp, I see. Mr. Pelham speaks highly of your intelligence. A pity you two could not reconcile your misunderstandings." The words slid like a blade beneath her ribs. Arthur's smirk across the circle confirmed that this was not accidental cruelty. It was a performance. "Mr. Pelham and I have nothing left to misunderstand," Beatrice said, her tone calm but her knuckles white beneath her gloves. Arthur stepped forward, bowing with exaggerated courtesy. "My dear Beatrice, the past need not define us. Perhaps it was fate that—" "Fate," she interrupted quietly, "has better taste." Gasps fluttered around them like startled birds. Arthur's practiced smile faltered. Calder, standing beside her, gave no visible reaction, but the subtle shift of his stance, a turn of the shoulder, a faint narrowing of the eyes, was enough to silence the whispers that followed. The orchestra struck up another waltz. Guests began to drift toward the dance floor, grateful to escape the tension. Hatherley excused himself with a shallow bow, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive tobacco. Calder offered Beatrice his arm. "You handled him beautifully," she exhaled, the faint tremor in her hand betraying her composure. "I did what was necessary." "Necessary," he echoed, studying her. "You speak of vengeance as if it were arithmetic." She looked away. "It must be. Emotion clouds judgment." His gaze lingered on her face, the soft light catching the delicate curve of her jaw, the faint tremble of restraint. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but it also gives it purpose." Beatrice turned her eyes toward the dancers below, their swirling gowns a blur of color and motion. "I cannot afford purpose, only precision." For a while, they stood in silence, the waltz filling the spaces between them. Calder's presence beside her was steady, grounding, like a wall against which she could lean without fear of collapse. Arthur's laughter reached them again, sharp and cruel. He had gathered a small audience, spinning tales of business misfortune and female naivety. Beatrice caught fragments of his words, the insinuation that she had been complicit in her own downfall, that her tears were crocodilian, her innocence feigned. Calder's expression hardened. Without warning, he crossed the room, his steps measured but unrelenting. Beatrice followed, breath tight in her chest. The crowd parted as he stopped before Arthur, his voice calm but edged with ice. "Mr. Pelham," Calder said, "I advise you to reconsider your choice of subject. Men of true standing do not need to raise their voices to wound others." Arthur's eyes flicked between them, the arrogance faltering under Calder's steady gaze. "I meant no offense," he muttered. "I am certain you did," Calder replied softly. "But I also suspect you lack the courage to face its consequence." The quiet authority in his tone silenced even the most curious spectators. For a moment, Beatrice could only watch as the man who had once abandoned her to ruin now bowed, his pride folding beneath Calder's composure. When Calder turned back to her, his expression remained impassive, but something unspoken passed between them. a recognition, a promise not of protection, but of parity. Later, while the guests drifted toward supper, Beatrice escaped the heat of the ballroom and found refuge in a narrow corridor behind the grand staircase. The faint hum of conversation reached her through the walls, mingled with the scent of roses, wilting in their vases. She pressed a hand against the cool marble and allowed herself a single breath of solitude. The silence broke with the quiet rhythm of approaching footsteps. Calder appeared at the corner, his expression softened by shadow. "I thought you might prefer a moment away from the spectacle," he said. She nodded, unable to summon words. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating through his coat, but not so near as to invade her grief. "You despise pity," he said after a moment. "Yes. Then allow me to offer something rarer." She turned toward him, her eyes searching. "And what is that?" "Presence." The word settled between them like a vow. Beatrice looked away, her voice trembling though she fought to keep it even. "I thought I had accepted what happened. But sometimes, when I wake, I can still hear the whispers in the church, the silence that followed his absence. It is as though humiliation has a sound that never fades." Calder said nothing. He simply remained beside her, his stillness a kind of mercy. The faint crackle of the sconces filled the quiet, mingling with the soft rustle of her breath. "You do not have to carry it alone," he said at last, his tone steady, almost reluctant. "Shame belongs to those who cause it, not to those who endure it." Her throat tightened. "You speak as though you understand." "I do," he said simply, "more than you think." Their eyes met then, and for a heartbeat, the distance between them dissolved. There was no touch, no gesture, only a silence that seemed to hum with everything neither dared to name. A voice called her name faintly from the ballroom, and the spell broke. Beatrice straightened, smoothing her gloves, her composure returning like armor. "Thank you, Mr. Wren," she said softly, "for standing beside me." He inclined his head. "Always where I am needed." As she rejoined the glittering chaos beyond the staircase, Beatrice realized that what Calder had offered her was not rescue. It was recognition. And in a world that had tried to erase her, that simple act of seeing her as whole was the most dangerous gift of all. Above them, the chandeliers swayed slightly in the draught of the corridor, their crystals scattering light like shattered truth. The ball continued, full of laughter and deception, but Beatrice felt a shift within her, a quiet, steady warmth against the chill of isolation. For the first time since her ruin, she no longer stood alone. And though the night around her glittered with falsehoods, she sensed that the alliance she had forged with Calder Wren was no longer merely a matter of strategy. It had begun to carry the pulse of something far more perilous and far more human. London, late spring of 1868, had turned restless. The air itself carried a tension like the moments before a storm, too still, too heavy, as if the city were holding its breath. The streets near Threadneedle and Cheapside murmured with rumour, investors growing nervous, ledgers vanishing overnight, a whisper that certain fortunes had been built on falsified ink. Beatrice Larkspur knew that truth better than anyone. Each day she walked through that district, her boots brushing against the soot-stained cobblestones, she could feel the invisible web tightening around her, woven by men who smiled in Parliament and schemed in private boardrooms. And at the centre of it all was Benedict Hatherley, his reputation polished like marble and his cruelty hidden behind charity. That afternoon, as the fog began to settle, a young clerk from Hatherley's accounting office arrived at Calder Wren's firm. His hands shook as he handed Beatrice a sealed envelope, his eyes darting toward the street. "Give this to no one but yourself, miss," he whispered. "Not even Mr. Wren. Not until you've read it." She frowned, sensing the tremor in his voice. "What is this?" He swallowed hard. "Proof. The kind that can ruin men or destroy those who hold it." Before she could question further, he turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving only the faint echo of hurried footsteps. Inside the envelope was a single page, an invoice dated and signed, with amounts that made no sense. It listed transactions between Hatherley's charitable fund and shell companies traced through Wren Industries, all tied back to the Larkspur name. One forged signature leapt from the page like a ghost. Arthur Pelham's, elegant and damning. Her breath caught. The document was more than evidence. It was a key, one that could unlock every lie that had cost her family their honor. That night, she carried it to Calder's townhouse on Park Lane. The lamps were dim, and rain struck the windows with quiet persistence. Calder stood by the fire, his coat discarded, his sleeves rolled back as he pored over a map of trade routes and names. When she entered, he looked up, surprise flickering behind his guarded expression. "You should not come here at this hour." "It's not safe." "Neither is the truth," she replied, placing the document on his desk. "Read it." He scanned the page, his brow tightening. "Where did you get this?" "From someone who's now likely being hunted for it," she said softly. "A clerk from Hatherley's office. He sought me out." Calder's voice turned grim. "That was reckless. If anyone saw him—" "If I waited for safety, I would still be weeping at an altar," she interrupted. Their eyes met, hers aflame with resolve, his shadowed with anger he could not quite justify. "Beatrice," he said after a moment, his tone quieter but no less firm, "you do not understand what you're inviting. Hatherley doesn't threaten, he destroys quietly. A drowning, a fire, a debt that cannot be proven false. If you continue this—" "I am already ruined, Calder," she said. "What can he take from me that he has not already stolen?" He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping just short of touching her. "Your life," he said, his voice low, "and that I will not allow." Her heart stuttered, not from fear, but from the way his words trembled on the edge between command and confession. "You cannot cage me because you fear the storm," she said. "You taught me to read the numbers, to see the patterns. You made me an ally. Do not now ask me to be silent." Calder's jaw clenched. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled, slow and defeated, his voice roughened by restraint. "Very well. But if you walk into this, you walk beside me." The next morning news spread through the city like wildfire. A young clerk found drowned in the Thames, his pockets weighted with coins, his death declared accidental. Beatrice felt her hands grow cold when she heard. The world had a way of punishing those who whispered truth. Calder found her that evening at her home, standing by the window, the newspaper clutched in her trembling hand. The glow from the street lamps cast a pale light over her face, making her look both fierce and fragile. "It's my fault," she murmured. "He helped me. He trusted me." "No," Calder said firmly. "It was Hatherley's doing. His warning to us." Her eyes lifted to his. "Then he underestimates me." That night marked the beginning of their open defiance. Together they traced connections across a sea of paper and ink, contracts, sealed letters, false signatures. Beatrice's mind moved with precision, her intuition sharp enough to cut through deceit. She had begun to anticipate patterns even before Calder explained them, and he, in turn, found himself studying her not merely as an ally, but as something rarer, a woman whose courage matched his own. Yet danger pressed closer. 2 days later, Nathaniel arrived at Beatrice's door, pale and shaking, clutching a crumpled paper. "They've done it," he whispered. "A promissory note in my name, £10,000, signed and dated last month. I swear, I never—" Beatrice's blood ran cold. She took the document from his hands and examined it. The handwriting mimicked his perfectly, down to the looping N in his signature. "They mean to destroy us entirely," she said, her voice barely a breath. Calder came that evening. The tension in the house was thick enough to suffocate. Nathaniel paced in despair, while Beatrice sat at the dining table, the false note before her. Calder read it, his face darkening. "This is meant to frighten you," he said, "to distract us." "It may do more than frighten," Beatrice said quietly. If they submit it to the court, my brother will be imprisoned. Hatherley will watch from his club with a glass of brandy, congratulating himself on his mercy. Calder met her eyes, and for once his mask of composure cracked. I will not let that happen. Beatrice rose abruptly. No, Calder, we will not let it happen. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement not of sentiment, but of shared defiance. That night, after Nathaniel had gone to rest, Beatrice and Calder remained in his study, surrounded by the faint glow of lamplight. The rain drummed against the windows, and the scent of wet earth drifted through the open balcony door. Papers lay scattered across the desk, proofs, letters, their lives laid bare in ink. Beatrice moved closer to the fire, her reflection flickering in the glass pane. "Do you ever grow weary of fighting shadows?" she asked quietly. Calder, seated behind his desk, regarded her in silence for a long moment. "Every day," he admitted. "But if you stop fighting, they consume you." She turned toward him, her expression softening. "How did you become this man, Calder? So careful, so armored." He leaned back, his gaze distant. "By mistake." "Tell me," she said. He hesitated, then rose and poured a measure of brandy, his hands steady though his voice had grown rough. "I was 23 when I married Clara. She was sunlight. She laughed at my seriousness, called me a man made of iron. I built everything for her. Every deal, every risk, it was all to give her safety." He paused, his eyes fixed on the fire. "When she fell ill, the doctors promised hope if I could afford a treatment abroad. I left her for 3 weeks to secure the funds. When I returned, she was gone. She died while I was chasing the means to protect her." Beatrice's breath caught, her chest tightening with an ache she did not expect. "I built this empire from that grief," he continued quietly. "Every contract, every coin, a monument to the one person who never asked me to build it. Since then, I have kept everyone at a distance. It is easier to lose what you never allow yourself to hold." Beatrice stepped closer. "And yet you stand beside me." He met her gaze, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "You are the first person I have met who makes distance feel like cowardice." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was alive, pulsing with something too deep to name. Then Beatrice reached for the document on his desk, the false promissory note, and tore it cleanly in half. "Then let us not be cowards," she said. Calder exhaled, a sound caught between frustration and admiration. "You are impossible." "Then you understand me perfectly." They both smiled faintly, though neither knew why. Outside, the rain began to ease, replaced by the soft whisper of wind. The city, restless and unforgiving, slept on, unaware that within that lamplit room, two people who had lost everything had found in each other something dangerous: trust. Calder watched her leave that night with a heaviness he could not define. The smell of ink and brandy lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of her perfume. On the desk lay the remnants of the torn paper, a promise destroyed, yet also a declaration. He poured himself another glass, staring into the fire. For the first time in years, the flames did not merely warm him, they reminded him that he could still feel. And in another house across the fog-drenched city, Beatrice stood at her window, watching the rain slide down the glass. She pressed her hand against the cold pane and whispered into the night, "We will not be silent." The city did not answer, but in its quiet hum she heard it nonetheless, the echo of Calder's vow, steady and resolute. And it was enough to keep her from despair, if only for one more night. The streets of London on that particular morning moved with deceptive calm. Horse-drawn carriages rattled along Whitehall, their wheels glistening with the damp sheen of early fog. Gaslight still flickered faintly under the grey sky, reluctant to yield to day. Behind drawn curtains and polished doors, the city spun its illusions, philanthropy dressed as virtue, charity laced with corruption. And in the heart of it all, the offices of the Hatherley Trust sat like a monument to deception, its carved stone facade promising benevolence while hiding rot within. Beatrice Larkspur stood across the street, the hem of her dove-grey skirt brushing the edge of a puddle as she adjusted her hat. Her appearance was plain by design, unremarkable and forgettable. She wore her hair tightly coiled beneath a modest bonnet. Her gloved hands, clutching a leather folder, and spectacles rested delicately on the bridge of her nose, distorting just enough of her striking features to render her invisible. She was no longer a ruined bride. Today she was someone no one would notice. The door to the office opened with a dull chime, and Beatrice stepped inside with the confidence of a woman who belonged. She had studied the layout for days. Calder had obtained floor plans through one of his discreet connections. She knew where the ledgers were kept, which cabinets were locked, and where Hatherley's senior clerk took his tea between 10 and 10:30. Behind a polished desk, a young assistant glanced up without interest. "Are you here for the sorting?" he asked, already distracted by the sound of type bars clicking in the next room. Beatrice nodded, her voice soft. "I've been sent from the Finsbury office. Miss Fairclough said to begin with the receipts." He waved a vague hand toward a side corridor lined with filing drawers. "You'll find what you need in the rear alcove. Mind the ink tray." She moved swiftly, each step practiced, each glance casual. At the end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of the main office's view, she found the alcove and the cabinet, heavy, brass-handled, locked with a polished keyhole. Her heart beat faster, but her face betrayed nothing. She pulled a folded cloth from her folder and set it on the table beside the cabinet. Inside the cloth lay the small iron key Calder had given her 3 nights earlier, painstakingly crafted from a wax impression and polished with oil. Her fingers trembled only once before she steadied them. The key slid in, a soft click. The cabinet door creaked open. Inside were bound ledgers, their spines marked only by date and number. She scanned quickly, fingers moving like the turn of clock hands, until she found the one Calder had described. March, 1st quarter. The ledger was heavier than she expected, the weight of deceit bound in ink and paper. She opened it. Each page told a story more damning than the last. Transfers to ghost accounts, donations that never reached the poorhouses, signatures falsified with care and malice. And there, halfway through, a transaction dated on a Sunday. A payment made in the name of the Larkspur Trust, witnessed by a man who, according to the parish records Beatrice had secured herself, had been attending his daughter's christening that morning in Greenwich, miles away. The lie gleamed from the page like oil on water. A sound startled her. Footsteps, voices. She froze, not from fear, but from a cold, calculating tension. The voices were unmistakable. Arthur and Hatherley. Her mind raced. They were earlier than expected. She pressed the ledger to her chest and glanced toward the service stair behind the filing drawers. She had to act. The footsteps drew closer. Then, silence. Beatrice stepped out just as they entered the corridor. Arthur stopped in his tracks, his smug expression vanishing in an instant. Hatherley's eyes narrowed. "Miss Larkspur," he said, voice like a razor wrapped in velvet. "I was under the impression you no longer held an interest in charitable endeavors." Beatrice straightened. "I have taken a renewed interest in how generosity is measured, Mr. Hatherley." Arthur laughed softly. "Still playing the martyr, are we? Still clinging to your pride like it hasn't already been dragged through the streets?" "Arthur," she said calmly, "I see you haven't changed, still mistaking cowardice for charm." He stepped forward. "You should be careful. A woman in your position should know when to remain silent. And you," she said coolly, "should know better than to forge a payment dated on a Sunday." He blinked. "I've spoken to Reverend Wilkes," she continued. "He remembers the christening well. Your so-called witness was holding his granddaughter at the altar at the very moment he was supposed to be in your office authorizing funds." Hatherley's face had gone still, the way porcelain stills before it cracks. "You cannot prove that," he said. "I can," Beatrice replied, holding up the parish register. "I brought a copy. Would you care to see it?" Arthur lunged forward, but a voice stopped him. "Don't!" It was Calder. He stepped into the hallway with measured calm, followed by two uniformed magistrates and a bank official bearing a stamped order. "Gentlemen," Calder said, "you are under investigation for fraud, forgery, and the misappropriation of public funds." Arthur turned pale. Hatherley's composure fractured, his mouth tightening in fury. "You think this ends with us?" he growled. "You think exposing two names will burn the rot?" "No," Beatrice said softly, "but it begins here." As the magistrates moved in, Arthur turned toward her with a venomous sneer. "You think this makes you righteous?" he spat. "You are nothing. You'll always be nothing. Just a bitter little girl playing hero." Beatrice's eyes did not waver. "You never mattered enough to break me." The words left her lips like a blade unsheathed, calm and sharp and final. Arthur's face twisted, but the magistrate seized his arm and pulled him away. The corridor emptied. The silence afterward felt deeper than any Beatrice had known. Calder remained beside her, his breath slow, his expression unreadable. She stood perfectly still, the ledger still in her hands, her shoulders drawn back like a soldier who had just fired the final shot of a long campaign. He looked at her then, not as a man looks at a companion, but as one looks at a force of nature. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it," she corrected. He nodded once. "Then allow me this moment to be proud." She turned toward him, her breath catching slightly. The fire in her eyes had not dimmed, but beneath it shimmered exhaustion, sorrow, triumph, and something more fragile than either. Gratitude. "Thank you," she said, the words quieter than the rest, spoken not with formality, but with weight. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The space between them vibrated with everything neither dared name, and in that corridor filled with dust and broken truths, Beatrice Larkspur finally allowed herself to feel what she had buried beneath pride and resolve. Victory. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the kind that came from endurance, from clarity, from choosing to rise rather than vanish. Outside, the bells of St. Mary Le Bow rang once, twice, 3 times, and the city at last began to turn in her favor. The city awoke to headlines inked in scandal. From Fleet Street to Mayfair, every newspaper bore the same thunderous revelation: banker Benedict Hatherley arrested in major financial conspiracy. Beneath the bold typeface, paragraphs traced the unraveling of London's most polished facades, charitable trusts exposed as laundering fronts, forged contracts linking political donors to missing funds, and names once whispered in reverence now steeped in disgrace. London, always hungry for ruin when it wore diamonds and titles, devoured the tale. Calder Wren, once the subject of hushed suspicion in elite circles, had submitted all his records to the Crown's financial magistrates within 24 hours of the arrests. His ledgers, immaculately kept, revealed no misconduct, only a man targeted for his influence and proximity to the very empire of deceit he had helped dismantle. And Beatrice Larkspur, once a pariah whose name had been spoken in pity and disdain, was now at the center of something extraordinary. The Crown sent a sealed letter delivered by hand. Nathaniel received it on her behalf and read it aloud that morning as she stood by the window in her modest sitting room, sunlight catching the edges of her shawl. "To Miss Beatrice Larkspur," he began, voice steady with something close to awe, "Her Majesty's office extends formal recognition for your service in the exposure of fraudulent financial conduct detrimental to the stability of the Crown's economic trust. Your courage and discretion reflect the values of a citizen committed to justice and truth." Beatrice did not speak. She merely reached for the letter and held it with a quiet reverence that held no triumph, only the weight of what it had cost her. The news of Arthur Pelham's sentencing arrived 2 days later. 7 years penal labor in the colonies, the notice read, the ink as cold as the courtroom where he had pleaded with the elegance of a coward too clever to deny guilt outright. The magistrate had not even blinked. The court had accepted his cooperation in exchange for reduced charges, but there would be no soft landing, no second chance in a drawing room or investors' club. He would be shipped with other debtors and swindlers to a faraway land where no one knew his name, and no one cared. When Beatrice read the verdict, she did not smile, but she did, for the first time in many months, exhale. Nathaniel, too, began to recover. Clients, once hesitant, now returned to the Larkspur firm, praising his integrity and apologizing for their retreat with careful diplomacy. He forgave them too easily, Beatrice thought, but she understood. In business, survival came before pride. And for Beatrice herself, something else began to grow, a quiet ambition seeded in the wreckage of her former life. On the south side of the city, not far from Clerkenwell Green, she opened a small office above a tailor's shop. The sign was simple: Larkspur and Associates, financial consultation. But the purpose went beyond ledgers and account balancing. She hired only women, young women, many of them daughters of seamstresses, laundresses and clerks, most of them clever and overlooked. She taught them what she had once learned under the weight of desperation: how to read an account line by line, how to identify discrepancies, how to calculate interest and track capital without blinking. Each morning they arrived with ink-stained fingers and shining eyes, and each evening Beatrice sat beside them at long wooden tables, reviewing their work, listening to their stories, answering their questions with a patience born not from superiority, but from kinship. One of them, Mary, asked her once, "Miss Larkspur, did you always want to do this?" Beatrice looked at her, softening. "No," she said, "but sometimes we do not find purpose. Sometimes purpose finds us when we've lost everything else." The girls adored her, though they never dared say it aloud. They admired the sharpness of her mind, the elegance of her presence, the fire in her silences. She made them feel that their labor mattered, not as an extension of a man's fortune, but as something that could stand on its own. One afternoon, a footman arrived bearing a gilt-edged envelope sealed with wax. The handwriting was unmistakable, looped, elegant, and too familiar. The Duchess of Norham, who had once turned her back at St. Bride's, now extended an invitation to her spring ball. "The scandal has passed," the card implied. "You may return now if you wish." Beatrice did not tear the letter. She placed it back inside the envelope and set it on the mantel. That evening, as the chandeliers of Norham House cast their glow on dozens of dancing guests, Beatrice sat at a simple dinner table beside her students. They ate together in a narrow room lit by lamplight, the conversation loud with laughter, the plates mismatched, the air warm. One of the girls had baked a tart that burned at the edges. Another spilled tea on her ledger, and Beatrice laughed, truly laughed, until tears came to her eyes. The Duchess could keep her ballroom. Here there was purpose, there was joy, and there was the sweet, fragile sound of a future being written in real time. Later that evening, after the students had gone and the lamps had been extinguished, Beatrice remained alone at the long table. The silence felt different now, no longer hollow, but whole. She reached for a blank ledger, opened it, and wrote in careful, steady hand, "Account of good faith, year 1. The fire in the hearth cracked softly behind her. Outside, the gas lamps flickered in the street. Somewhere in the city, another scandal was surely brewing. But in that moment, smoke had given way to sunlight. She closed the ledger, her fingers lingering on its worn cover, and whispered to the quiet, "I did not break. Not for Arthur, not for Hatherley, not for London. She had stood in the fire, and she had survived." The night settled around her gently, and in that stillness, Beatrice Larkspur smiled, for herself, for what she had built, and for the women who would walk through doors she had once been denied. The winter had receded quietly, leaving London softened beneath a gentle blush of spring. In the narrow streets near Clerkenwell, where factory whistles no longer drowned the sound of morning, Beatrice Larkspur walked with purpose toward her office. The hem of her dark green skirt brushed against cobblestones still wet from an early rain, and the scent of ink and soot drifted faintly through the air. Above her, a sign bore her name alone. No gilded flourish, no borrowed prestige. Just plain lettering and earned dignity. Inside, the rooms buzzed with activity. Girls hunched over ledgers, whispering about decimal placement and inconsistent tallies. Beatrice passed among them like a lighthouse among waves, steady and alight, her hands lightly touching shoulders, her voice a murmur of correction and praise. She had become what society had never imagined for a woman who was once left at the altar. That evening, as the golden light deepened the color of the worn wooden floors, Calder Wren stood quietly in the doorway. He did not knock. He never did. She always sensed him before sound. "You're late," she said, without turning. "I waited until the light was right," he replied. She glanced over her shoulder, her lips curved in amusement. "Are you courting poetry now?" "Only when standing in doorways, with dust on my coat, and nothing prepared but a question." She faced him then. Her blouse was high-collared, the lace carefully repaired, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hands bore ink stains, her face held no makeup. And yet, in that moment, Calder saw her more clearly than he had ever seen anything in his life. "Ask it," she said. He stepped closer. His voice was low, almost reluctant. "Your name beside mine, on every page, not just contracts, not just deeds." A silence fell between them, neither heavy nor brittle, but thoughtful. Beatrice did not look away. She studied him, as one might study a well-worn volume whose spine had held under fire. There was affection in her gaze, but also caution. Not the kind bred from fear, but the kind earned from survival. "I care for you," she said at last, "but I have fought hard to become myself, not someone's wife, not someone's cautionary tale." Calder did not flinch. He nodded once. "Then take the time you need. I will not ask again." "And yet you will wait," she said. He offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Yes, because I want you, not to complete me, not to save me, but because every time I breathe in this world, I want you somewhere in it." She lowered her gaze, blinking slowly, as if the weight of such truth was not something easily held. The following months unfolded like chapters in a book she never thought she would write. Her essays were published first in small circulations, pamphlets distributed at markets and coffee houses. The fraud behind the velvet curtain, currency and credibility, a woman's view, the cost of silence. Each was written in her own name, no pseudonym, no initials, just Beatrice Larkspur. Members of Parliament began to take note. A clerk from the Exchequer wrote requesting clarification on her breakdown of compound interest as a weapon against the working poor. A solicitor from Manchester sent a letter praising her clarity. One week, a former duchess asked to meet her. She refused. Behind the printing presses, Calder Wren moved like smoke. He paid for typesetters when sales could not cover the cost. He ensured copies reached desks that mattered, but he never left his signature on a single sheet, and still he did not ask again. In her office, ledgers multiplied. The young women she trained were now training others. On Thursday afternoons, Beatrice held open hours where factory wives, governesses, and even a retired actress sought guidance on savings and debt. She made time for each. No story was beneath her attention, no mistake too small to correct. One afternoon, long after the chiming of nearby bells had marked the close of formal business, Calder appeared again. The light slanted through the high windows, catching in her hair and turning it almost bronze. She was surrounded by open books and half-drunk cups of tea. One of her students, Mary, the girl with quick hands and a quicker tongue, sat beside her, frowning over a complicated ledger. Beatrice guided her gently, her fingers brushing the girl's wrist. Calder said nothing. He watched from the threshold. It was Mary who noticed him first. She blinked at the figure in the doorway and glanced at Beatrice. "He's back," she whispered. Beatrice looked up. Their eyes met. She smiled. But it was not the hesitant smile of a woman waiting for approval. It was not the nervous grin of someone hoping not to offend. It was a smile that came from assurance, from peace, from something hard won. He felt it then, the shift. She no longer needed him. She had built something out of the ruins, not just a name, not just an office, but a world, a possibility. She had looked into the mouth of betrayal and had not blinked, and now when she looked at him, it was not with dependence, it was with choice. He stepped into the room, slowly. Mary stood and excused herself with a conspiratorial wink. Beatrice did not rise. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Will you stay?" she asked. He sat. "Only if you want me to." She lifted her teacup and took a sip. "I do." Outside, the bells of St. James echoed across the rooftops. The sky held the lavender haze of late spring. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing a violin, poorly. It didn't matter. In that quiet room above a tailor's shop, two people sat across from each other. No declarations, no grand vows, just the acknowledgement of presence. Calder reached across the table, not to take her hand, but to push a ledger toward her, one she had missed. She laughed, and with that laughter, something unspoken was sealed. Not a rescue, a partnership, a beginning. The bells of St. Bride's tolled once more, not with the echo of abandonment, but with the resonance of renewal. The early summer morning was cool and pale, the sky streaked with silver light as London stirred beneath a soft breeze. Horses clattered in the distance, carriage wheels turned over cobbles, and the scent of roses from the flower stalls near Ludgate Hill drifted into the old church's open doors. Inside, the pews filled slowly, not with the idle curious or the hollow elite, but with those who had witnessed her quiet triumph. Seamstresses in pressed calico, bankers with modest chains at their vests, printers with ink still beneath their nails. There were students from her small office, governesses whose debts she had helped renegotiate, and a clerk who once said her ledgers taught him to see his mother with new eyes. Beatrice stood at the threshold, the long aisle stretching ahead like a page yet to be written. She wore no white, for hers was not a union of untouched beginnings, but of earned trust. Her gown was plum silk, cut with elegance and restraint, the colour bold and commanding. No veil covered her face. Her hair was swept into a low chignon, simple and dignified. Pinned to her collar was a jet brooch, round and modest. Her mother's. It rested over her heart. Nathaniel stood beside her. His arm was steady, his expression solemn and proud. Gone was the shadow of disgrace that once hunched his shoulders. He had recovered more than clients. He had recovered himself. "Are you ready?" he asked. Beatrice nodded, her voice firm. "I have never been more." They began the walk. Each step was deliberate. She heard the rustle of skirts, the clearing of throats, but her eyes remained fixed on the man who waited at the end of the aisle. Calder Wren did not wear a nobleman's finery. His black frock coat was well made, but unembellished. There were no medals, no cravat pinned with sapphires, only a white linen collar neatly folded. His hands were clasped in front of him, his face calm. But in his eyes, those grey, steady eyes, there was something that trembled beneath the surface. He had not asked again. He had simply waited. The ceremony was brief. The vows exchanged were not embroidered with poetic declarations. They were simple, honest. "Do you come of your own will?" the vicar asked. "I do," Beatrice replied, "without rescue, without obligation." Calder's answer was just as firm. "And I, not to claim, but to walk beside." When the words were done and hands joined, a hush fell. Then a rising sound. Not applause, but the soft sound of breaths released, of hearts exhaling. It was not a grand wedding by society's measure, but it was whole. Outside the day had grown warmer. Sunlight filtered through the old stained glass windows as guests spilled onto the steps. Calder did not offer her his arm. She took his hand instead. Their fingers laced, not with trembling anticipation, but with assurance. A newspaper boy passed nearby, shouting the midday headlines. folded beneath his arm, bore a name no longer whispered. Arthur Pelham transported, 7 years penal labour in Australia for financial fraud. Beatrice glanced at it briefly, then looked away. That chapter was closed. Later that evening, in the quiet parlour of their new home, a townhouse modestly situated near Lincoln's Inn, Calder lit the last candle and turned toward her. The room was filled with flowers sent by students, friends, allies. On the table lay a small, cloth-bound volume. He lifted it and handed it to her. It arrived this morning. First print. Beatrice took it in both hands, the texture of the linen cover grounding her. Women, wealth, and the written word, an inquiry into financial autonomy. She opened to the first page. The dedication read, "For those who were silenced and chose to write instead." Her breath caught, not from surprise but from the weight of it, the truth of it. She looked up. "It was never about revenge," she said softly. "No," Calder agreed. "It was always about voice." She leaned back slightly, resting the book against her lap. "And what do we do now?" Calder sat beside her. "We write the next page. Together." Their hands found each other again, not for the first time, not the last. In the flicker of candlelight, with London quiet beyond the curtained windows, there was no need for declarations. Only the knowledge that what they had was not built in haste, not forged in desperation, but formed slowly, earned, and held. A vow fulfilled. London, 1881. The city had changed. Smoke still curled from the chimneys, and the bells of St. Paul's still rang through the fog, but the pace of the streets had quickened, and women walked with firmer steps, heads held higher than they once dared. Votes were still a distant promise, but voices, those were rising everywhere. Inside a sunlit building on a quiet lane near Russell Square, the brass plaque on the door read, "Larkspur and Wren. Financial Consultation and Education for Women." The rooms were filled with shelves of ledgers and well-worn teaching charts. A quiet bustle reigned. Ink-stained fingers, the rustle of skirts, the low murmur of arithmetic lessons punctuated by the occasional outburst of laughter. In one corner, a boy of 6 dropped his slate and promptly burst into tears. "Thomas," said a woman with a soft voice and a firmer spine, "what have we said about crocodile tears?" The boy's lip quivered. "They're only for when one truly hurts." "Precisely." She crouched and lifted him gently, brushing back a dark curl from his forehead. "Come now, you can help your sister check the accounts." The girl, barely 8, with Beatrice's cheekbones and Calder's steadiness, nodded from the desk, her feet not quite reaching the floor. From the doorway, Calder Wren watched the scene unfold with the quiet awe of a man who had once thought such peace was for other men. His temples were silvering, but his shoulders remained strong, and in his gaze still lived the same reverence for the woman he had chosen, and who had chosen him back. "Your staff said you had a meeting," he said, his voice low and familiar. Beatrice turned, her plum-coloured skirts swirling around her. "I did, with future bankers and lawmakers. Fierce ones." He stepped inside, setting a folded newspaper on her desk. The headline read, "Women's Credit Union opens in Manchester under Larkspur model." "You're changing more than ledgers now," he said, pride resting beneath his words. She looked down at the paper, then at him. "We're changing it." Outside the window, the world bustled on. Trams clattered, voices called. The old city marched forward. But in that room, time paused. "Do you remember," she said after a moment, "how I once walked down an aisle on my own terms?" "I remember," Calder said, "that I waited for you with my heart in my throat." Beatrice stepped closer, lifting her hand to smooth the line of his collar. "Do you regret waiting?" He shook his head slowly. "Not once. You were worth every hour." And they stood in the hush between past and future, surrounded by the rhythm of a life they had built, not as a rescue, not as a compromise, but as a vow lived and renewed, quietly, daily. Arthur Pelham was long gone, vanished into the red dust of the colonies, forgotten by all but the courts that kept record. Benedict Hatherley had died in prison, disgraced, his family name stripped from every charitable plaque it once adorned. Nathaniel, now a lecturer in business ethics at Oxford, visited often, still adjusting his cravat with nervous fingers before addressing a room. He never married, but his letters were filled with warmth and stories of students who reminded him, unbearably, of a sister who taught him how to stand again. And as for Beatrice and Calder, the years had not softened them. They still argued over balance sheets, still debated social policy over dinner, still kissed in the hallway when the children were asleep and the world was quiet. Their love had not faded. It had deepened, aged like the oak desk where she first drafted her essays, like the ink that now signed proposals under both their names. No longer forged in fire, it was forged in endurance, in shared mornings and hard-won rest. And sometimes, when the children slept and the lamps dimmed, Beatrice would open her first book and read the dedication aloud, as she had once done years ago on their wedding night, for those who were silenced and chose to write instead. Then she would look up and smile at the man who never asked her to be anything but exactly who she was. And Calder, with the same quiet awe, would smile back, because he knew that he had not married a bride. He had married a revolution. And he loved her more every day for it. Every story leaves behind an echo. And perhaps what Beatrice Larkspur teaches us is that dignity is not something granted, it is something claimed, that even after betrayal, even after public shame, a woman can rise, not to return to who she was, but to become someone stronger, bolder, freer. This is a story of justice, but also of tenderness, of power reclaimed without vengeance, of love that does not rescue but stands beside. Beatrice and Calder remind us that healing is not always quiet, and that the greatest revolution may begin with a single voice that refuses to be silenced. If this story moved you, stirred something within you, or made you believe again in the kind of love that honors who you are and who you fight to become, we would be so grateful to know. Tell us what this story meant to you in the comments. And if you've made it all the way here, write the word revolution so we know you walked this entire journey with us. If you'd like to support the passionate team behind these stories, you can leave a super thanks in the amount your heart and means allow. It helps us continue bringing to life romances that inspire, heal, and transport. If a contribution isn't possible, sharing this story with a friend is just as powerful. Word of mouth keeps our stories alive and growing. And if you're craving more tales of love forged through fire and grace, don't miss the other timeless romances linked in the cards above. There's a whole library of heroines waiting to meet you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in stories like this. Until the next chapter.